morning.
Should probably say good morning. How's everybody doing? There we go.
Super fantastic.
Look at me, I'm a professional. Oh, I was all ready to just jump right in this morning, but I gotta bring something up first. When I came in this morning, those songs were on the board. Eric and I had no previous discussion leading up to this morning. So the passage we're going to be reading out of is Luke chapter 10, where Jesus talks about the greatest commands.
Wow.
Normally I'm super composed and I'm cool, I'm a cool customer, but that spoke to me,
All right.
Now that I'm composed, I guess we should get started. But go ahead and mark Luke 10, starting in verse 25. We'll get to it in just a minute. So, it's the early 90s. There's a woman laying on the floor of her apartment. And she's going through withdrawals from her drug of choice. She's having a really hard time with it. Her infant son is sleeping in the crib in the next room, and her husband has gone out to try and get more drugs. But she knows, in her heart of hearts, that if her husband finds drugs, he's going to take them for himself, and she'll be left on her own. Now, this woman is different from what you would think when I initially describe a woman like this. She's an educated woman. She has a master's degree. She grew up in a privileged home, came from money, and upon graduating saw all the heartache in the world and decided to live a life of poverty in order to experience it. And unfortunately, through making those decisions, she has turned down some bad roads, and she has become a drug user. And after her parents discovered this, her mother gave her the number of a Christian counselor and said, please, if you won't talk to us, if you won't get the help you need, please call this number. And so after milling on it for an undisclosed amount of time, laying on the floor of her apartment, going through withdrawals, in the middle of the night, she picks up the phone, she dials this number. And it's the middle of the night, and so when the man picks up the phone on the other end, he's asleep and groggy and a little disoriented. It's, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I've gotten calls that late before, and it's, you need a minute to wake up. And so after a minute of waking up, the man clearly sits up and wakes himself up and begins talking with the woman. And she starts going into how she's in this bad way, and her mother gave this number to her, and she proceeds to talk to the man. And they talk for the rest of the night. They talk until about 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. And he listens to her, and he is compassionate, and he does everything he can to help her through this extremely difficult time. Because she knows she needs to make a change. Because she's neglecting care of her son, she is using drugs, and she knows that she'll be dead soon if she doesn't change something. And so they continue to talk. And around the end of the conversation, she's feeling better. He's given her a list of things to work on, places to go get help. And he has helped her get through this. And she's talking to him, and periodically throughout the conversation, she keeps bringing up, well, you're a Christian counselor. Do I need to read the Bible? Do I need what do I need to do? And he kind of dodges the question and said, well, let's just talk about what's going on right now. Let's figure out what's going on with you. And so, at the end of the conversation, she's agreed that she needs to make changes, and she's going to find the changes. She's going to separate herself from the drug culture. She's going to get the help she needs, and she's going to do a better job of raising her son. Towards the end of the conversation, the man is apprehensive on the phone. She's trying to figure out why. Why so apprehensive? And he says, okay, well, I need you to not hang up on me. But you dialed the wrong number. This man was a complete stranger. A complete and total stranger. And upon listening to the woman's story, he decided to spend the rest of the night on the phone with her because he was afraid that if she hung up, if she got discouraged by dialing the wrong number, he's afraid she wouldn't dial the right one and she wouldn't get the help she needed. And so he stayed on the phone for the rest of the night with her. And while the woman is recounting this story, to this day, she has no idea who this man is. And towards the end of her story, she talks about how obviously this wasn't a quick fix. Obviously, she didn't spring right up at 7 o'clock that morning and said, well, I'm done with drugs, let's go ahead and get on with it. No, she said it was an incredibly hard time in her life. But that initial conversation got her through it. Now, in Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25, on one occasion, an expert of the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked, and who is my neighbor? It's an excellent question, and we'll get to the obvious story here in a second. Who is your neighbor? Is your neighbor based on geographic location? Is it based on the person next door? The person next door moves. Are they still your neighbor? What are the logistics of being your neighbor? The expert in the law asked the question because he did not want to know who is my neighbor. He wanted to know who is not my neighbor. Who am I not responsible for helping? Where am I in the clear? Where am I able to separate myself from circumstance? Now, obviously, the story we're about to read we're familiar with, and obviously it parallels to the woman in the story in the beginning in some ways. Obviously, she is not presented with two bad choices before getting to the first choice. But what I want to focus on is not the bad of the story, but the good. Because I've got some interesting facts that I discovered while researching this. And so continuing on, verse 30. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity upon him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Now, what I never really, because that's the great thing about the Bible, that's the great thing about stories that Jesus told, is that no matter how old you get, there's always something new to discover as you read them. And there's something I never really considered before. The cost that the man put up to take care of the man that was attacked by robbers. 2 denarii. Because it's one of those things where I've read books that were written overseas before, fiction, nonfiction, things like that. And when they talk about currency kind of in their own native language, I'll look at it and say, okay, well, this costs 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 of whatever, krona, yen, whatever it is. And I look at it and go, well, I've got no idea what that means. And so I've got to look and I've got to kind of translate to myself. And so what I read in one of the commentaries was the money that was given to the innkeeper was enough for this man to be taken care of for a couple of weeks. Now, I travel, we travel, you travel sometimes. How much does a hotel, a motel, the rattiest motel, even cost for a couple of weeks? Kind of expensive. Most of us, when we travel, we stay in halfway decent accommodations, It ranks, whatever it does per night. And to stay there for a couple of weeks, it's a decent wage. Like when I travel to West Virginia to see friends, I have to think, okay, well, like where do I want to stay? How long do I want to stay for? And things like this. And so this man, when taking care of him and bandaging up his wounds and making sure he had a roof over his head while he had time to recover. None of those things were required of him. It would have been enough to get him off the street and to patch him up and kind of send him on his way. Even in that, we're like, that's a good job. That's a good thing you did for that person. And the Samaritan said, no, I'm going to take him further. We're going to provide accommodation for him. We're going to give him time to recover. We're going to make sure the innkeeper knows to take care of this man. And we're going to make sure he knows that when I get back, I'm going to pay for any further expenses there are. It's not always about giving everything all the time, but it's about doing the best that you can. This Samaritan examined the situation and said, what is the best job I can do in this situation? It's interesting when you think about how this parallels to the story of the woman. She has reached out. She is trying to find help. She is in dire need, and her life is in danger. Now, was it the best possible care she could have gotten? I have no idea. I have no idea what the other person would have given her. I have no idea what the other person would have provided for her. Was it the care that she needed in that moment? Absolutely. She was in a position where she was in dire need, and it was provided to her. And not only was it provided to her, it was provided to her through the most unusual of circumstances. A complete stranger woken up by a phone call in the middle of the night to what must have sounded like a very upset and confused woman. She is going through drug withdrawal. She is upset. She is confused. She is exhausted. She is angry. And so that's your wake-up call in the middle of the night. Would I have handled it the same way? I have no idea. But it's one of those things that it's stories like that are out there to kind of make you ask yourself the question about what kind of provider am I for my community? What am I doing? How am I involved? Who am I involved with? Am I able to help when needed? Am I able to provide? Jesus uses the example of the Samaritan because Samaritans were not looked upon greatly, especially by people like the expert on the law. Oh, a Samaritan. Not a Samaritan. No, Samaritans, they're bad news, they're trouble. They're not gonna help. And so the story is less about the people who passed on the man in need, although that is an important aspect of the story. You can do a whole other lesson about the moral responsibility of helping others when you recognize a problem. Because we see that, especially in America, we see like economic poverty, we see people in the street begging for money. And that's a problem that's pretty much existed since the beginning of time. But the circumstance in which, the priest and the Levite found this man was not begging for money, but in dire need. And so yes, you could do a whole other lesson about that, but what I'm going to focus on is the Samaritan and the work that he did in that moment. I really grappled with two separate scriptures today, because the other one, of course, is whatever you do to the least of these, so you do unto me. The idea that when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. That was the other passage of scripture that I really thought about focusing on today, and I at least wanted to mention in passing, because I didn't specifically use it, because the Samaritan story works so well in this circumstance. And so you look back at this woman and you say, okay, well, she got one good phone call. What's one good phone call going to do in her situation? She's a drug user. She has these problems. She is neglecting care of her infant son. What good is that phone call going to do? What good is going to befall this man who is getting patched up? Well, what good comes from it is they get to live. They get to continue on. And a couple of years ago, that baby, that infant son, graduated from Princeton University with honors. And she realized Towards the end of her story, she talks about the difficulty of after that day. That day where she knew she needed to make a change. She knew she was in need, and she knew she needed help. And so, in confusion and exhaustion, she reached out. And we've all been there. We've all been in a dire situation where we have been in need before. For many of us, that's our conversion story. That's the story of, I remember where I was when I got baptized. I remember where I was mentally and emotionally, and where I needed something to change in my life. I needed someone to save me from myself and my sins and my transgressions. And so, in the same way, where we are both the Samaritan and the victim in many ways. Because when we start out, when we're in need, God provides a way for us. God provides answers, God provides care, God provides opportunity. We only need to take it, just as the woman did. She wanted to get out. She needed an opportunity. She needed a circumstance. She needed a boost to provide to her in order to save her. And so in many ways, when we are young, when we are new, when we are without God, we are the victims. And then as we grow stronger, as we become closer to God, as we become closer to our community, as we become more versed in the scriptures, we then have the opportunity to be the Samaritan. We have the opportunity to provide care for those. Because we recognize in those in need something that was in us at some point. I was not always a Christian. I was not always a follower of God. I have walked that path. I have been without. I have done without. And I heartily do not recommend it. I don't recommend it. It's just one of those things. And so, neighborly deeds are about going beyond the basics. Yes, we can be good neighbors. Provide that cup of sugar to your neighbor. Be there for them in the most basic of times. But it's also about going beyond the basics. The Samaritan treated the man, funded his recovery, and took care of his needs because he was able to, and because he knew it was the right thing to do. The story of the Good Samaritan is about the people that God intends us to be. That though the story features robbery and betrayal and violence and tragedy, the story is about the ending. The story is about how the man was provided for, about how he was taken care of. I'm one of those optimists. I'm one of those people who strives to be like Jesus. Where when I look at circumstance and I ask myself, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. It was such a radical concept for Jesus to be pitching. The idea that our neighbors are everywhere. The idea that the opportunity to provide and assist is surprisingly vast. And to know that no, we cannot solve all of the world's problems. We cannot take on every challenge. We cannot finance every operation. But that's not what the Samaritan thought. The Samaritan did not think, I'm going to save the world. The Samaritan did not think, I'm going to take it on all by myself. I'm going to figure all this out on my own, and I'm going to solve all of the problems. No, he looked at the circumstance in front of him, and he said, I can fix that. I have the means, I have the opportunity, and I'm going to fix this problem. Because honestly, that's how, I talked about that a while ago, the idea about how we change the world every day in small and insignificant ways. And in order to change the world in a significant manner, it takes time and preparation and effort and God. You want to change the world in a significant manner? Listen to what God has for you in store. Jesus told him in verse 37, Go and do likewise. Not go and do that exact same thing, not go and just work on the specific problem, but go and do likewise. Look at the lessons that can be drawn from this. That was the powerful thing about Christ's teaching. Jesus could tell a simple story over a dozen or a couple dozen verses. He could tell a simple story and you could dissect that thing. You could pick it apart and you could draw 20 lessons from it. Because that's the kind of teacher he was. He spoke in such simple ways. He told such simple stories that people could understand. I look at the story and I understand who the players are. I understand the crisis. I understand the resolution. I understand the things that I can draw from this to improve upon my own life. And that is one story that Jesus told. That is one lesson that he gave. And he obviously gave many more besides that. It's about doing what you can. It's about what Jesus said in that other passage that I referenced, about whatever you do to the least of these, so you do to me. It's about providing the opportunity in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our regions, in our country, in our world. There are neighbors in need. There is somebody out there, there is something, and this is the really kind of hard thing to swallow, because you think about yourself and your own circumstance, and you say, well, I'm just a person, I'm just a family unit, I'm just part of a couple, I'm whatever I am, and you think, what can I do? And I'm here to tell you that there's something that you can do. There is somebody's life that you can improve upon by introducing them to the teachings of Christ. There is something that you can do as an individual, as a couple, as a family, whatever it may be, as a church, as a body of believers. There is something that you can do where Jesus says, go and do likewise. That's such a great wrap up to that story, because Jesus was always very direct and very to the point. And so the expert on the law is looking for a way out. He's looking for a way to not bear the brunt of so much responsibility. And he asks, who is my neighbor? And Jesus tells him this story. And when I heard the story of this woman who had gone through such an intense circumstance, I was really moved by it. I was really moved by this circumstance because, and this, once again, like, God speaks to me and I am moved by his power every day. In a very minor way, it ties into what I referenced when I first got up here. It ties into how, when I walked in this morning, those songs were on the board. Eric and I never talked about it. I never talked about what I was talking about. I just came in here, said, I've got my lesson, let's get this started. And then the song before the lesson ties into what I'm talking about. So, I'm trying to think of a word and I can't. Improbable. So improbably beautiful that if you had to calculate it by mathematical odds, it would be insane. The idea that out of the more than 1,000 songs in this book, he just happens to pick the one that I need to lead into this lesson. And in the same way, this woman reaches out for help. And she reaches out for help and she finds it. But she finds it in not the place that she was expecting. She finds it not in the number of this person, but she finds it by dialing the wrong number and getting the help that she needs. You know, you could get your phones out and you could dial a random number right now. And you probably wouldn't come up with, the perfect person to solve. I'm having financial problems. I'm having, whatever it may be. But in the circumstances in which we really, truly, honestly need help, if we ask God for it, God will find it for us. God will find a person or a circumstance or a group. As long as we are reaching, whenever Jesus talks about communicating with God, whenever he talks about prayer or knocking on the door and having it open and having opportunities provided to us. He's not talking about some automated process. He's not talking about dial a God, 1-800, pray for me, and then you go through like the automated menus, and then boom, you get your answer. He's talking about real, earnest communication with God. Those moments that, yes, there are moments where we automatically, we kind of passively pray. We can pray for food, we can pray, whatever it may be. There may be times where we're not in it all the way, where there's something distracting us or there's something going on. But God recognizes the times where, and I won't go into particulars, but I can mark the handful of times in my life where I have been empty, and I have been on my hands and knees, and I have prayed, and I have cried, and I have screamed, and I have yelled that I needed answers. And in each of those circumstances, when I needed it the most, God provided it for me. There was a solution, there was an opportunity, there was a way out of the problem I was in. And over the years, I've become easier at trusting God. It's one of the things that I got to work on as a person. Because you look at those circumstances in your life, you look at the trials and the tribulations and the difficulties, and you look at it and you go, I don't know, God. Are you sure this time? I mean, I know you were right the last 7,489 times, but I'm not sure about this one. And so it's gotten easier for me to talk to God. And it's gotten easier for me to trust that there is a way out of the circumstances that we are in. And like the woman, and like the Samaritan, and like the victim on the side of the road, he has been set upon by robbers. He has been beaten. He is near death. He has lost everything on him. And he prayed, and he reaches out and he needs a solution. And it was provided for him by the actions of somebody who stopped and did good. And so Jesus says, go and do likewise. And that's the hammer at home point of the week. Go and do likewise. Stories like that I really like because stories of the woman and what happened to her, I like because they happened. It's so great whenever you read an inspirational story on Facebook or some kind of meme going around or some kind of little bite-sized thing. But I'm always a little disheartened when I read it and I go, oh, this is just an example. This is just a story. And there is a time and a place for that. But when I read a really powerful story like what happened to this woman, and I listen to it in her own words, I'm so moved by that. And so if you're here today and you're reaching out, if you're here today and you need a solution, the waters of baptism are available. Because much like the woman, her problems were not solved overnight. Her problems were not solved instantly once the one good thing happened. But it's the start. And that's how problems get solved. That's how solutions are found. Solutions are often not found in an instantaneous, amazing recognition of clarity, although sometimes they are. But most of the time, we need a start. And for Christians, that's baptism. And then for some of us who are baptized, if you're here today and you need prayers, if you need God to help you find a solution, prayers are available as a congregation, as an individual. I will pray for you. Whatever it is, whatever we are seeking, I ask that you meditate on it as we stand and sing the Song of Invitation.